Well, good morning, Tess. Thank you so much for inviting me to this interview. It's really an honor to be able to share some of the experiences and successes that we've had with helping our clients secure funding for their important projects. So I am the Northwest Water Resources Group Lead for Ardurra. Ardurra acquired TO Engineers in 2022, and we're really excited because we're able to leverage our national firm's resources to help us with design and funding for our projects. So my background, I'm a farm girl. I grew up on a small cattle ranch in Buell, Idaho. My dad was a old school farmer. He still irrigates with flood irrigation out of ditches and corrugates. And so I learned the most important lesson of all is that water always flows downhill. And I implement that in my practice every day and use it as a good gut check if something isn't quite making any sense. So I'm really passionate about agriculture, and with this new funding opportunities that have been made available through the different federal infrastructure bills, I just want to make sure that we're able to transform our irrigation infrastructure for the next 100 years, just recognizing that all of our infrastructure was constructed around the turn of the century in 1900s, and that many of those structures have either degraded or failed. And this is really the opportunity to implement the federal funding to make these projects happen and get ready for the next 100 years. So that's where we're at, and I just think it's a really exciting time. As far as funding projects, I think it'll be really great to go through this interview and help people understand that process because it can be very intimidating. And Ardurra is an engineering firm. We're a full service engineering firm, and we work with our clients to help them secure funding as part of our total support of services for their design projects. And what we'll go through in this interview is just the steps that you can take to help you get to that point. And it, of course, varies based on the type of entity that you are and where you're located within the country. But for most of this presentation, we'll be talking specifically about projects in the Western United States because a lot of the federal funding is focused on those Western infrastructure projects. And thank you so much for the opportunity to share our services. So we are an engineering firm, and we provide planning documents, so master plans or system optimization reviews, SORs. We also work with different entities to develop infrastructure planning documents that they can use as part of their grant process. We really supply our funding support as really just one piece of the overall package to go from conception to construction. And we also provide surveying services. We have design services for water conveyance. We have diversion structure design. We do any kind of construction observation that's necessary, contract management, federal grant support for reporting and administration. We work with you on contracting. We go through the whole process. So our goal is to help each entity resolve the problems that they're facing by helping them secure funding, taking them through the planning process, any kind of environmental review that's necessary, permitting that's required, construction, design and construction documents, contracting, then construction observation and project closeout. So we take you through the whole process. Well, there's a lot of different ways. My email address is hzobott@ardurra.com. I think the best way to get a hold of me is on my cell phone, which is 208-421-8257. And then if people are on LinkedIn, I'm also on that resource. But I think those are kind of the main ways to get a hold of me. A lot of people have been getting through to me through Bob. So thank you, Bob, for sharing my contact information with everyone. I really appreciate that. And then we can just start talking about what you guys are looking for. So I'm just really eager to help people align with the funding to help get their projects completed. Okay, so the first thing that I like to do is meet with clients to understand what are their problems and what are the projects that are keeping them up at night. So oftentimes what I'll find is we'll meet and we'll discuss a project, and then we'll find out that there's also additional projects. And one of the reasons why that's important to understand the whole picture is that much of our funding opportunities are related to holistic projects or projects that address more than one resource concern. So we want to make sure that we understand how we can best align a project or a group of projects with the funding and make that project score the best that it can. So the first step is usually a meeting or a phone call just to discuss, what they're interested in and how that project might align with available funding sources and schedules. And then after we discuss the initial concept, then I develop a funding strategy, thinking about the different federal and state funding sources that are available, with the goal being to minimize the amount of match that's necessary for that project. And then I present a scope of work to the entity so that they can then work with us directly to help them get through that process. Overall, that process of hiring an engineering firm can be a big hurdle, because if you are an entity that is a quasi-municipal or municipal entity, you typically have to go through a formal request for qualifications process, especially in states with qualifications-based selection, like the state of Idaho. And so that requires developing an RFQ and then going through the selection process formally to provide the best, most qualified firm to be able to respond to your request for qualifications. If you are an entity that is a nonprofit entity or a private entity, those requirements are more lenient, although with any kind of federal funding, it is recommended to do a formal process, because federal funding often requires it as part of the contracting process, and we want to make sure that any funds that are spent are matchable and or reimbursable by the grant that's secured. So it's interesting, but a lot of federal opportunities will actually allow for expenses to be incurred before the grant is contracted. And so some of the costs related to planning, if the engineering firm is selected in the appropriate process, can be then reimbursed through the grant process. I love talking to people on the phone and hearing about their projects, and we can just communicate so much information so quickly when we're talking about something directly. So I do think that that's a great way to do it, but I'm also happy to set up Zoom calls, especially if it's out of state, so that we can get that face-to-face time and help build our relationship for the funding effort. Where a client is at in the project, it's really important to recognize that funding needs to be at the very preliminary stages. There are very few grant funding mechanisms that will fund a project that is either in construction or near the end of construction, because that money has already been spent and that cannot be used for past construction. So I think the first thing to look at is where you're at in your project development phase, and recognizing that planning for funding really needs to happen about 18 to 24 months before construction will start. There are some state funding mechanisms that can fund in as soon as 6 months, but those typically have much lower funding levels than the federal funding that requires the longer timeline. And all of the federal funding will require some sort of environmental review to meet the NEPA requirements, National Environmental Policy Act, that reviews projects for impacts to environmental, cultural, and archaeological resources. So I think overall, yes, within one phone call, I can give you a pretty good percentage as far as what we think we can align you with. But if somebody came to me and said, hey, I'm going to start construction next month, I need $5 million, I would say you have a very low percentage of getting that funding by the time you're ready to start construction. So I think that would be the main limitation that I see when I'm communicating with clients. As part of that planning process, I would develop a list of funding options that I think would be well aligned, and then I would prepare a scope of work with associated costs to prepare the funding applications. And one thing that's important to remember is that there's really two elements to any kind of funding application. There are the grant writing elements related to the compelling narrative and meeting the requirements of the funding opportunity. And then there are the preliminary and conceptual engineering elements. So the grant writing elements are not qualified expenses for any kind of funding mechanism, but the preliminary engineering and conceptual engineering are qualified expenses. So I really like to look at that as two phases. Sometimes clients will want to do a distinct planning phase where they go and pursue funding specifically for that preliminary and conceptual engineering. And so we would go out and find funding for that and then implement that initial engineering phase and then go to the more extensive grant writing phase. And by doing that, we're able to help clients save a little bit more money. However, when we do that process, that lengthens the time period for when we could expect the funding for the specific project that they are trying to construct, because we then are adding an additional funding cycle before we get to the infrastructure project. So we'd have a funding planning cycle, which develops a engineering report of some sort that's used to then secure the next level of funding. But within that planning document, that initial engineering report, we're able to identify multiple projects so that that document can be used for multiple funding applications. So depending upon the system and the need for extensive infrastructure improvements, it might be worthwhile, especially if an entity is thinking about starting construction between 3 and 5 years in the future. They would definitely have time to go through that planning phase as well. There's really the two elements. There's the grant writing element, and then there's the preliminary or conceptual engineering element that we rely on to help us develop the compelling grant. So what I do is I work with entities and evaluate the information that they have. It can be measurement information from head gates. It can be the amount of shares for each individual farm or takeout. It can be actual measurement data within ditches to evaluate losses. It can be anecdotal in some cases, where we know from a long history that a certain percentage of the water is lost to seepage and or seep holes in specific reaches, and we have some sort of physical documentation of seep holes or gravelly areas that we can rely on to make some assumptions. But I collect a lot of data in the beginning, and then I evaluate that data to see what I can determine from that to estimate water losses and efficiency, because many of the projects do look and rank overall efficiency improvements as part of the funding picture. So they'll rank projects that increase efficiency by at least 10% higher than they might look at a project that only increases efficiency by 5%. So that is one element of the engineering that we look at. We also look at delivery efficiency. So being able to measure and document the amount of water delivered to each user, because we often see that entities are over delivering water to one user or a group of users just based on the infrastructure that they have in place. Either it's antiquated or it is not working correctly, and so they're unable to measure deliveries accurately. And then we look at the region and see what type of demands are on the water supply. So for instance, in the state of Idaho, one thing that we're constantly balancing is the incidental recharge to the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer versus the efficiency improvement by implementing a lined canal or some sort of piping structure that eliminates that incidental recharge. So we work really hard to balance those two water resources and do projects that we call recharge coupled, where we're replacing lost incidental recharge with deliberate recharge to the aquifer. So that's just one example of how the engineering will evaluate the resources to help determine the magnitude of the losses for efficiency analysis, and then also how we look at the region and see how the water resources are being used so that we can maintain those water balances and not detrimentally impact other water users within the same region by implementing the efficiency improvements that we're recommending in the funding application. My experience has been mainly in the state of Idaho, but we also have a really incredible funding team that's located in California, and they're working in California and Nevada. And the only difference for us being able to work in states like Montana is just building those relationships within the state agencies. And that does take some time, but it is not a difficult process, and it's one that's really just driven by our tenacity and our interest in helping secure that funding for our clients. So I think that I would say wherever you're at, if you want to give us a call, we can do that legwork and help see what additional state funding that we can leverage. As far as the federal funding, I think that we're well qualified for any state for the federal funding elements, and that we can definitely help clients with some of the bigger programs like the Bureau of Reclamation, Water Smart, or some of the NRCS funding mechanisms like RCPP or other opportunities. What we really want to do is think about projects from the perspective of the funding agency. And so we like to take projects and make them unique and make them stand out and make them important to not only the state, but the federal entities that are reviewing it. One thing that's really interesting about some of the funding agencies is that we don't have a set of defined reviewers that are reviewing it every single round. We actually get different reviewers. And it's really about telling that compelling narrative and making people feel emotionally connected to the project and understanding how those projects will be impactful not only to the community, but the country. Because we all know water in the West is really important, and without it, we are not going to be able to sustain our agriculture and the growth that we need for our country. So I think that when we look at a project, it may be another water efficiency project, but what makes it unique, what makes it stand out, and that's what we try to highlight. For that question, I think it's just important to recognize that every year we have many different funding opportunities that come out through the USDA, NRCS, and the Bureau of Reclamation. There are also funding opportunities with DEQ. And I'd like to say that they all come out at the same time, but they don't. They come out throughout the year, and those funding opportunities post a little bit differently each year, depending upon the previous cycle and how long it takes to get through the review process. So I would recommend that wherever we're at in the year, clients go ahead and reach out to me, and I can help them understand which funding opportunities are coming up next, and then which ones they'll have to wait for the next year if they're more aligned with that funding mechanism. And just as an example, using the state of Idaho, because their funding cycles don't change from year to year, the Aging Infrastructure Grant for water delivery entities will be closing on August, the first week of August, generally like August 5th, and then the next round will close in December. So they'll have two funding opportunities in the second half of the year, and then they do not have any aging infrastructure until then. The flood control grants with the Water Resources Board are due in June, and there's some funding opportunities with Water Smart that are closing in the first half of the year. So I would say right now we're preparing for applications in the fall, and then next spring for those opportunities that just passed. That's a great question. And yes, what we like to do is to prepare a grant application and then use it as much as we can for all the funding opportunities that it can be tailored to. So using the Water Smart family as an example, we may prepare a grant for the water energy efficiency grant, but then also tailor it to a drought resiliency grant. The difference being that there are different fundable elements within each of those mechanisms. And just for an example, the drought resiliency funding opportunity through Water Smart, and it allows for recharge. So in the water energy efficiency one, we would only propose the efficiency projects, but in the drought resiliency, we might couple the recharge and the efficiency projects. And so we just tailor it for each funding opportunity so that it scores the best that it can. Yes. A lot of times we will combine as many projects as we can so that we can hit all those different resource concerns or partnership concerns. So we might submit a project that's an efficiency project, a recharge project, a recreation project, and a municipal project and an agricultural project. And when we do that, we're just checking more boxes that help it rank higher. Yeah, that's a really tough one. When I was talking earlier about how each agency reviews the funding applications, they have their own unique process. So for instance, with the Bureau of Reclamation, they have a detail where different people within the organization can volunteer to review the funding applications. And then depending upon how many funding applications they have and how many people they have available to review it, that really determines the length of time that the funding applications are under review. When we applied in 2021, the review time period was between 3 and 6 months. Right now, we're seeing that closer to 6 months. And so it just depends upon the competition for that particular funding cycle, and then also the resources available to review those documents. And they do not provide a distinctive timeline, but I think as a general rule of thumb, all reviews are completed within 1 year and selected because they want to make sure that they don't see the same applications over and over again because they weren't selected yet. Does that make sense? So like if you applied in 2024, they don't want to see the application in 2025 because you're still waiting on your selection from 2024. So they do like to get those out as soon as they can. It's very typical to see matching funds at 50% of the project. That's especially true for all of the Water Smart programs, except for some of the aquatic restoration programs where we can see a little bit higher levels for projects that provide ecosystem benefit. The NRCS will fund higher levels depending on the type of project. So under the WFPO funding opportunity with the NRCS, they will fund up to 100% of flood projects and then 75% of agricultural projects. And so there are some better funding levels depending on the timeline for when the project will go to construction and the type of project that the proposal presents. Yes, I think that first of all, funding can be very intimidating, and getting a project from conception to construction is a process. And I would encourage the different entities to take that first step, make that phone call either to Bob or myself just to see where we're at as scale and, what a general range of costs might be so that they can start conceptualizing it, because it does take time to bring the different boards up to speed and get them behind a project. And so the sooner you start this process, the better. And then one of the things that I really have felt is important is that with competitive funding, it is important to move quicker so that you have less competition in order to help your project be selected. That doesn't mean that a great application isn't a great application in later funding cycles, but when we delay, we end up having a little bit more competition as we go through the funding cycle and the available funds. And so I wouldn't recommend waiting until the very last funding cycle to try to secure your funding for your project, especially because each funding opportunity we apply for, we learn information that helps us better tailor the funding application for the funding. So I think you asked us earlier, or asked me earlier, if you could submit the same funding or the same project to multiple funding sources. And we definitely do that where we customize it to each funding opportunity. But we also take funding applications. For instance, if we applied to water energy efficiency grant in 2023, and now it's coming out in 2024, and we learned from our debrief session with the Bureau of Reclamation that we didn't highlight these 3 items, we can rewrite that so that it's a stronger application that then ranks better. So having the opportunity to apply multiple times is a really great strategy to secure funding. And it's very efficient from a cost perspective because the majority of the work has already been completed during the initial funding application. So I would just encourage clients to be steadfast and to go for it, and to know that it is a process and that sometimes you have to submit multiple applications in order to get your project funded. But in the bigger picture of the project, winning millions of dollars to complete the construction is a very good reward for the efforts that are put out in the planning phase with the funding. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yes, Hattie.
Yes.
May I do one follow-up question? My takeaway was that you're better off before you start construction to get a hold of you, because if you start construction, you may limit your chances or what can be reimbursed. And it's but it doesn't necessarily mean you can't get funding. It just may have limited what you could get because you started construction or what have you before you decided to apply for a grant. So is that correct? Or
Yes, for sure. It's really best to start securing funding much before you have the full design or construction ready to go. The percentages drop down really fast, especially because you need to have the project contracted with the funding agency before you go to construction in order to get reimbursed for it. And most of the costs are in construction.
Thank you, Hattie. Been very helpful. And I think would encourage people to contact Hattie as early as possible, or myself if you are unable to reach her, although she's very available for clients. Thank you so much for your time today, Hattie.
Yes, thank you guys. I think this is really great. And I just look forward to hearing from people that need some help with their projects, because I would love to help them.